The gospel was first preached in Jerusalem. And then before very long, it had spread northward into Syria and in a city called Antioch, which became the great mission-minded church of the first century. Then it spread across Asia Minor and into Europe and finally came all the way to Rome. The entire New Testament world had been saturated with the gospel. And one of the reasons that within those few years the gospel is spread all across the Roman Empire is because of Paul of Tarsus. Saul of Tarsus went on 3 missionary journeys. Each of them began at the city of Antioch. And on his first missionary journey, he took a ship across a portion of the Mediterranean Sea and preached the gospel in what was called Asia Minor. He planted churches all over Asia Minor and then returned to Antioch. It wasn't long until he went on a second journey, and he went back to Asia Minor and planned to do additional work there, but God stopped him. We're not told how God stopped him, but he stopped him. Finally, Paul didn't know what to do, so he went down to a seaport town called Troas on the Aegean Sea, and he waited to see what the Lord's will was. And it was in the night, while he was at Troas, that Paul had a vision. He saw a man of Macedonia over across the Aegean Sea in Europe. And the man said, "Come over into Macedonia and help us." The book of Acts says that immediately Paul and his company came into Europe, and they planted churches there. There was the first church in Europe at Philippi, another church at Thessalonica, still another in Berea. But because of opposition from unbelieving Jews, Paul had to leave Berea, and he went down into the southern part of Greece to the city of Athens. I want to present a 2-part message this morning and next Sunday morning that I'm calling Athens. This is one of the great cities of the New Testament, Athens, the glory of Greece. And the subtitle today is "Come over to Macedonia," because that's how the gospel came to Athens. And what I want to do is to begin today with the man that God used to take the gospel throughout the Roman Empire. We know him as the Apostle Paul. We don't know what Paul looked like. We just have no information that would be counted as authoritative. But we do have an early word picture that comes to us from about the 2nd century, close to the time that Paul did his work. It is written in an uninspired book, sometimes called apocryphal books, but is a picture of what Paul might have looked like. It's in a book called The Acts of Paul. And the author said that Paul was short in stature, that he was bald in head. I like that part about him. He was bowed in back. His eyes were close together. His eyebrows met in the middle. And his legs were bowed. I don't know whether that's accurate or not, but I know something that is. In the New Testament, the Corinthians said that Paul's bodily presence was weak. There doesn't seem to have been anything about him that would commend him as a handsome man. But that little Jew traveled over 6,000 miles for the cause of Christ and planted the church in cities throughout the Roman Empire. And you see, God had prepared him for that work. He had been born in Tarsus of Cilicia in Asia Minor. It was an important New Testament city. It had a great reputation. He went to synagogue school there. I know that because every Jewish boy went to synagogue school. But his parents were not content that he just have that training. They sent him down to Jerusalem to sit at the feet of the great Gamaliel, the doctor of the law. And there he became an expert in all the things pertaining to Israel. And in our day, he would have been a PhD in the law. God was preparing him for an important task. Paul spoke Greek. He even quoted the Greek poets. And he was a Roman citizen. I don't know whether the city of his birth had done something spectacular for the Roman emperor, or if his father or grandfather had done some great service, because that's the way Roman citizenship was often given. When Paul was born, he was born as a free Roman. Here is a man that belonged to the community of the Jews, the community of the Greeks, and the community of the Romans. God had prepared him to go out into the world of his day and to meet every man on his own level. And it's that man that eventually would bring the gospel to Athens. You see, Paul's method of evangelism was to visit the major cities of his day. And then he would plant the church there. Hopefully, the people who were converted would spread the gospel to the towns and villages around the area so that the whole world could be saturated. And Paul's method would bring him to the city of Athens. Now, the second thing I want to do is tell you something about Athens. The greatest glory of Athens had already passed by the time Paul visited there. But it was still the center. It was the center of art and literature. It was the center of religion and of philosophy. The city of Athens was the city of Aristotle and Socrates and other great names from history. And Paul came to Athens because of that vision he had had of the man saying, "Come over into Macedonia and help us." Macedonia was northern Greece, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea. Achaia was southern Greece, and it was there that Athens was located. Now notice second that when Paul came to Athens, there were certain things that he saw. Some of the things that Paul saw 2,000 years ago, you would see today if you visited Athens. Paul saw a city that was totally given to idolatry. Everywhere he looked, he saw altars and shrines built to false gods. But he certainly saw the Acropolis. It means a high city, and it is a high place in the city of Athens. If you went there, you would see from afar the Acropolis. And the most famous building in all of Greece, I suppose, the Parthenon, you would see there. It was there when Paul visited. The Parthenon was erected for the service of Athena, the chief female goddess of the Athenians. When Paul visited there, he might have, like most tourists, appreciated all of the buildings and all those shrines and all of those temples, and especially the Parthenon. And it isn't to say that Paul did not observe those things, but what really impressed him was the idolatry. That's what he saw. Now, let's move to a third area, and that is his visit. When Paul comes into Athens, he is there because of that Macedonian call. I don't know where he might have gone had God not stopped him in Asia Minor, and I don't know where he might have been next. But the Macedonian call was such that he would come to Athens. And during his visit to Athens, notice, number two, notice that he's by himself. When he left Berea, he left under less than desirable circumstances. Timothy and Silas, his traveling companions, stayed in Berea, and Paul came to Athens. There are no other believers there because the cause of Christ had not been planted yet. And Paul is by himself. And being by himself, he must have been lonely, for his preaching companions, in the face of such great idolatry. Now, having said all of that, let's come to the setting. The setting in which Paul preaches in Athens is such that our text this morning from the 17th chapter of Acts says that when Paul saw what was happening in Athens, his spirit was provoked. That word, translated provoked, means that he was angry. But it doesn't mean that he was out of control, having lost his temper, as we might consider the word anger to mean. But this word means that when he saw all of the idolatry, that he is upset. He is concerned that so many people are lost, that are worshiping false gods. You may remember that the Old Testament, while it was written originally in Hebrew, was later translated into Greek down in Egypt and became the Septuagint version. And in the Old Testament, we often meet the anger of God. And in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the word that is used here by Luke to say that Paul was provoked is used for God being provoked with Israel because of their sin. What all that means is that Paul was upset for the honor of God. Just like in the Old Testament, God is upset with his people for his own honor that he will share with nobody. Paul is provoked. Now, while Paul waited for them, that is his traveling companions at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols. And therefore, he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with the Gentile worshipers, and in the marketplace daily with those who happened to be there. And when Scripture says that Paul reasoned, that word means discuss or even to debate. It is the word for dialoguing. Paul might have used the method of Socrates, asking and answering questions. But because he is provoked, he goes to the Jewish synagogue. In any city that he visited, where there were at least 10 adult men of the Jewish faith, there'd be a synagogue. And he went to the synagogues because he, being a Jew, had that relationship already with the people who would be there. But because he is recognized as a doctor of the law, he would probably be asked to speak because he would be considered a distinguished visitor. And in the synagogue services, they always read from the law of Moses, from the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and then from the prophets. And from the law and the prophets, Paul then would preach the gospel. So he always went to the Jewish synagogues. But notice also that Luke says he went to the marketplace. Now, the marketplace was a public assembly place. It was where merchants sold their wares. It was where children played and thieves stole, and where different ideas were discussed. As a matter of fact, near the marketplace, there is a place then as now where orators would give their speeches and people would gather around, and it was where trials were carried on. Scripture says he went to the synagogue and he went to the marketplace and he debated, dialogued, discussed with whoever might be there. But there's something else that occurs in the text. Then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him. Athens was famous for its philosophers, and they're there. They hear what Paul is preaching, and it sounds strange to their ears. And they said, let's listen to what this babbler has to say. I doubt that there's anybody who was about to speak in public who would appreciate the introduction. Let's hear what this babbler has to say. Because the word itself means a seed picker. And what they were accusing Paul of is this guy really doesn't know what he's talking about. He's just out there picking up this thought and that thought and another thought from what he hears others say, and he's like a bird picking up seeds. But let's listen to what he has to say. I want to have you notice that when Paul is discussing with the philosophers, he is going to declare what they had never thought of and what they needed more than anybody. So I want us to notice from Acts 17 three responses to what Paul was doing. The first is the response of the religious Jews. They met in their synagogues every Sabbath. They heard Paul speak there at that Sabbath meeting. But they were not very responsive to the gospel because they held to their long-held beliefs. As a matter of fact, they're religious, but they're so tied to their traditions that they couldn't hear the gospel. Nobody would question whether or not the Jewish people in Athens were sincere in their religion. They were sincere, but something got in the way of them hearing the truth of the gospel. Now, a similar thing can happen today. There's a very real sense in which every human being is religious. He may not practice any kind of religion, but there's a sense in which he is religious because all of us are. We may not know what it is, but there's the longing in the human spirit for God. God put it there, whether we know it or not. It can only be satisfied with God. Men are religious. But the Jews were holding to their traditional views so much that they could not see the true and living God now made known in Jesus Christ. It reminds us that a person can be sincere and sincerely lost. Paul himself knew about that. He would have been a persecutor of Jesus' church. And one time he was giving a defense for who he was before unbelievers, and he said, I have lived in all good conscience before God unto this day. Was he sincere in what he was doing? Yes. Was he right in what he was doing? No. That's the reason that every person needs not simply to believe something, we need to weigh what we believe by the revealed will of God in Scripture. It isn't enough for somebody to tell us what to believe, but we must know what to believe because we have searched and found for ourselves. And let us remember this, that near the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7, Jesus said, not every one that says unto me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. We can never discover the will of God by what we think or what we hope or what we've always been told. We can know the will of God by the revealed Scripture. But that's one response. Then there is the response of those in the marketplace. Luke notes that The marketplace was where whoever happened to come came. Paul was there daily. On the Sabbath, he went to the synagogue. Then daily, he's disputing in the marketplace. But the result of the marketplace was that it was too casual. There weren't enough people here who were taking Paul seriously. And while they might have been willing to hear, they were not willing to do. Did you know that at Athens, Paul had, as far as we know, about as little success as he did anywhere? Now, I would hasten to say, Paul did not fail at Athens. He was true to what God wanted him to do. Many times in the Old Testament, the prophets of God are rejected by the people, and you can hardly find anybody who is affected in the right way by what they said. But they were successful because they were fulfilling what God asked them to do. There is the religious response that is blinded by tradition. There is the casual response of the marketplace. And there are people who still respond to the message of the cross in a similar way. There are even people in the church who fail to respond to the message of God as we should. Jesus, to the church at Laodicea in Revelation chapter 3, calls that lukewarm. Lukewarm is a bit like average. It's just as close to the bottom as it is the top. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be average in anything. And there are Christians who are content to be average. Oh, they're not turned off of God, but neither are they excited about God. It's just somewhere in the middle, seeking neither to be for or against. How do I respond? How do you respond? Jesus said of those that were lukewarm that they made him want to vomit. There was that response. And then the third response was from the philosophers, and we're going to deal with them more in detail next time. The philosophers responded to Paul's message because they were trend seekers. They were not interested in hearing what the message was about, except as it might contain some new thing. There's still people like that, you know, ready to get on board of anything that's different, anything that's new, without ever questioning, is this right or not? And the philosophers followed the trend. Don't you believe that those three responses at Athens are the responses that we make? But I want to tell you that before this story ends, there will be those in Athens who will believe and will follow the preaching and teaching of Paul. They'll become New Testament Christians. That's the response that each of us needs to make. And there is historical evidence that there was a strong church planted in Athens. It means that people obeyed the gospel and they lived right. When we obey the gospel and live right, the Lord is honored and is glorified, and we are the people of God. In the Bible class this morning, I was reminding those who were present that if we believe what God says and we obey what He asks us to do, then we enjoy every promise that He makes. Everyone, whenever they come face to face with Scripture, do respond. It's not whether we respond or not, but it's how we respond. And some hold to their traditions. Some are casual, polite, nice, but they're not going to do anything about it. There are those who are ready to follow any trend. But thank God there are always those who want to become more like Jesus. Where do you find yourself today? And what changes would need to occur in your life for your response to be pleasing in the sight of God? And could we help you with that today? If the answer is yes, you would like to respond to the invitation, then you're invited this morning. Let's stand together and be singing.
Let us rise up and build in the name of the Lord, joining hands.